What observers are now calling the most consequential diplomatic reversal in a generation unfolded during a joint press event between the United States and Canada. And it shattered the one weapon Donald Trump has wielded without consequence throughout his entire public life: the assumption that he always gets the final word. The setup was unremarkable: two podiums, two national flags, a room packed with journalists, and live broadcasts feeding into every major news organization across the globe. Pre event briefings had framed the occasion as an exercise in managed diplomacy. Cooler tones, constructive framing, a visible signal to international markets that two of the world's closest allies were working through disagreements like statesmen. That framing held for roughly 6 minutes. Trump spoke first. For the bulk of his opening remarks, he stayed inside the boundaries his communications staff had drawn. He acknowledged the depth of the bilateral relationship, pointed to areas of mutual economic interest, and employed restrained language that carried the clear imprint of preparation. Then, in the final 90 seconds, the script dissolved. His rhythm changed, his posture shifted forward, his language left the institutional lane and entered raw improvisation. He opened by attacking Canada's negotiating posture, then escalated to what he described as a refusal to acknowledge reality, and then stepped across a threshold that no trade confrontation between these two nations had ever approached. Turning toward Prime Minister Mark Carney, who stood roughly 6 feet to his left, Trump said Canada's position in the dispute was, and this is verbatim, frankly, pathetic. He continued by suggesting the Canadian government should stop embarrassing itself and accept terms that reflected the actual balance of power between the two nations. The word pathetic detonated in the room. Diplomatic correspondents who have tracked every chapter of the U.S.-Canada relationship said afterward that this was not policy critique, not negotiating theater, not the type of careless aside that aides quietly walk back in the hallway. This was a direct public assault on the character of a G7 partner, a founding member of NATO, and the single largest energy supplier to the United States. And Trump delivered it with the composure of a man who fully expected it to land without response. Because every verbal blow he has thrown across 5 decades of public life has landed without meaningful response. For the first time in that career, he miscalculated. Carney did not react immediately. He allowed approximately 3 seconds of silence after Trump's final word, a pause that analysts would later describe as a clinic in tempo control. It created distance between the attack and the reply, making the response feel chosen rather than reflexive. It carved out a moment of quiet that enlarged the weight of whatever followed. The room drew in. Cameras tightened their framing. Then Carney stepped to his microphone, faced the central camera, and delivered a reply that ran exactly 12 seconds. His exact words: Canada is your largest energy supplier, your closest military ally, and the only G7 nation that has asked you for nothing in 18 months of economic aggression. The word pathetic describes the leader who insults the ally he cannot replace. It does not describe the ally. 41 words, 3 sentences, then silence. Carney did not expand. He did not cushion the landing with diplomatic softeners. He stood motionless, expression level, hands resting on the podium. What followed transformed a bilateral press event into footage that will be studied for decades. For 11 full seconds after Carney stopped speaking, Donald Trump said nothing. The camera that had been alternating between the two men held on Trump, and what it recorded was a sequence of micro-expressions that behavioral analysts would later describe as among the most revealing passages of nonverbal communication ever captured in a political setting. In the first 3 seconds, Trump's face held the configuration of a man expecting more. A slight forward lean, mouth partially open, the posture of anticipation. Seconds 4 through 6 brought visible recognition that no additional words were coming, followed by rapid lateral eye movement, a pattern behavioral scientists associate with active cognitive search, the neurological signature of a mind scanning urgently for a response it cannot locate. Seconds 7 through 9 brought a tightening jaw and narrowed eyes. Seconds 10 and 11 resolved into a performed mask of indifference, a deliberate projection of unconcern that persuaded no one in the room, because the preceding 8 seconds had already made the inner landscape visible. When Trump finally responded, the content confirmed what the camera had already shown. He said, That's a nice little speech. Then pivoted to a talking point about trade deficits that had no logical connection to anything Carney had said. The dismissal was the tell. A man holding a genuine counter-argument would have deployed it. A man with a sharper insult would have thrown it. That's a nice little speech is the verbal equivalent of retreating from a confrontation while announcing you chose not to fight, a maneuver that functions only if the audience didn't just watch you spend 11 seconds searching for a weapon and emerging empty-handed. The room had watched. The cameras had recorded. The footage had preserved the search in frame by frame, permanently replayable form. Within hours, the 12-second clip had accumulated over 180 million views. It had been transcribed, translated, analyzed, and quoted in the legislative chambers of 9 countries. Constitutional scholars cited it in op-eds. Negotiation theorists incorporated it into case studies before the day had ended. 3 major international news organizations ran it as their lead story, each framing it identically. A 12-second statement by a Canadian Prime Minister had achieved something that 4 years of political opposition, legal proceedings, and relentless media scrutiny had never managed. It had left Donald Trump visibly, verifiably, publicly without words. The structural sophistication of Carney's response rests on a 3-movement architecture. The first movement, roughly 5 seconds, established factual ground. Largest energy supplier, closest military ally, the only G7 nation that had made no requests during 18 months of economic confrontation. Every element was verifiable, documented, and immune to challenge. Canada supplies approximately 60% of all American crude oil imports. The military alliance is a matter of treaty. The diplomatic record confirms the absence of Canadian requests throughout the standoff. By anchoring the opening in facts, Carney removed the possibility of any rebuttal based on disputing the foundation. There was nothing to dispute. Every claim was true. The second movement, roughly 4 seconds, redirected the word pathetic. Carney did not say you are pathetic. He did not trade insult for insult. Instead, he took Trump's own language, Trump's own chosen weapon, and rerouted it with surgical precision. He said the word pathetic describes the leader who insults the ally he cannot replace. This was not a counter-insult. It was a reclassification. It said, the word you selected is accurate. You simply pointed it at the wrong target. Responding to a reclassification is fundamentally harder than responding to an insult. An insult can be returned. A reclassification must be contested. And contesting this one would require Trump to argue that insulting a nation you depend on for energy supply and military cooperation is not, in fact, pathetic. An argument no audience present would accept because the dependency was visible and the insult had just occurred. The third movement, roughly 3 seconds, delivered the closing logic. 4 words. It does not describe the ally. The briefest sentence of the 12 seconds carried the most structural weight. It completed the logical sequence by placing Canada outside the scope of the word and, by necessary implication, placing Trump inside it. The word had been defined. The definition had been applied. The ally had been excluded from the category. The only figure remaining within it was the leader who had introduced it. The sequence was complete. There was nothing to add and no legitimate rebuttal available because the conclusion followed necessarily from premises that were matters of public record. 12 seconds, 3 movements. Facts, redirection, conclusion. Each movement foreclosed a category of response until every avenue of rebuttal had been sealed, and the only available option was silence. Financial markets registered the exchange within hours. The Dow declined 280 points in the first hour of trading the following morning, not in response to any policy shift, but because the footage introduced a variable that markets read instinctively. A leader who can be publicly silenced is a leader whose authority has been visibly compromised, and compromised authority is a risk factor that markets price without delay. 2 multinational corporations with significant cross-border operations paused pending expansion decisions. A European luxury hospitality group quietly removed a Trump-branded property from its portfolio. International booking figures at Trump-affiliated venues recorded their steepest single-week decline since the trade confrontation began. The White House communications operation spent 48 hours cycling through 3 response frameworks, each of which intensified the damage it was designed to contain. The first was dismissal. Senior advisors characterized Carney's response as scripted and theatrical. That framing collapsed immediately against the footage itself, which showed a delivery so unhurried, so precisely modulated, and so entirely devoid of performance that it read not as theater, but as its opposite. The calm statement of a man who had no need to perform because the facts were doing all the work. The second strategy was deflection. The White House redirected attention toward trade data, releasing a document outlining bilateral deficit figures and arguing that substance, not rhetoric, was the proper focus of the dispute. That approach failed because no major outlet covered the document without first airing the 12-second clip as context, guaranteeing that every viewer who encountered the statistics had already seen the footage of Trump standing silent. The third strategy was escalation. Trump issued a series of statements describing Carney as weak, characterizing Canada's trade posture as unsustainable, and promising consequences that would dwarf previous tariffs. This was the most self-defeating of the three approaches, because each new statement confirmed that the 12 seconds were still reverberating 48 hours after the exchange, that the president was still processing them, still reacting to them, still unable to move past them. Every additional statement extended the footage's lifespan and served as independent verification of its impact. The international diplomatic response followed a pattern that analysts described as quietly devastating. The Élysée Palace issued a statement that made no direct reference to the exchange, but reaffirmed France's deep respect for Canada's role in the international community and its commitment to diplomatic discourse that honors the standing of the nations involved. The word dignity appeared twice. It implied that dignity had been absent from the exchange without specifying which party had failed to provide it, which meant every reader supplied their own answer, and the answer was not difficult to reach. The United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary asked directly whether describing an ally as pathetic constituted appropriate diplomatic language, paused, offered a measured smile, and said that Britain's view was that alliances function best when the parties extend to each other the respect the alliance itself demands. 9 nations issued 9 variations of the same message. None defended Trump. All affirmed Canada, not by name, but by principle, which carried more force because principles resist rebuttal more effectively than positions do. The domestic political fallout moved along fault lines the White House had been laboring for months to stabilize. The central liability was not the insult itself. The base could absorb the word pathetic. They could read it as unfiltered directness. The central liability was the silence that followed. An insult that lands can be celebrated. An insult that gets answered with 12 seconds of facts, leaving the man who threw it visibly searching for a response in front of a global audience. That cannot be celebrated because it contradicts the core brand promise at its most fundamental level. 3 Republican senators issued statements within 72 hours. None criticized the use of the word directly, but all 3 addressed the exchange in language that carefully circled the concept of silence with unmistakable intent. One called for more disciplined messaging in bilateral contexts. Another called for a review of communication strategy in diplomatic settings. A third said, the United States should project strength through substance rather than through rhetoric that creates openings for adversaries. That last phrase, creates openings for adversaries, was the most consequential language any Republican senator had produced about the episode, because it reframed Carney's 12 seconds not as a fortunate counterpunch, but as an opportunity that the president's own language had manufactured and handed over voluntarily. The insult had not merely failed. It had armed the opponent. What distinguishes this moment within the long history of U.S.-Canada relations is not the existence of a trade dispute. Tensions over commerce have persisted across generations. Tariffs have been applied and withdrawn. Negotiations have fractured and resumed. What has no precedent is a sitting American president being rendered publicly wordless by a 12-second reply from a Canadian prime minister, with every second of the exchange preserved on camera for permanent review. The footage captures the silence. And the silence, in the context of a man whose entire public identity is constructed on the premise that he is never without a response, represents the most consequential 11 seconds of his political life. The ramifications have spread into institutional territory that analysts say will shape international dynamics for months ahead. The exchange has been captured, archived, and distributed through every diplomatic information network on the planet. Its significance extends beyond its content to what it demonstrated in real time. A head of state publicly degraded a partner nation and was answered with 12 seconds of facts arranged so precisely that the insult reversed course permanently. That demonstration carries implications that reach far beyond the US Canada relationship. It shows that insults at the head of state level carry specific vulnerabilities that policy disputes do not, because insults invite personal responses. And personal responses from skilled communicators can inflict damage that policy debates are structurally incapable of reaching. Four nations currently in active trade confrontations with the United States have requested copies of the Canadian government's communication framework through diplomatic channels. Other nations are examining the architecture. Other governments are reverse engineering the structure. A senior analyst at a prominent European foreign policy institution told the Financial Times that the exchange has established a principle that will alter how smaller nations approach direct confrontations with larger ones. The principle is unambiguous. Precision defeats volume. Facts defeat insults. A leader who can be publicly silenced by 12 seconds of verifiable information is a leader whose verbal aggression carries diminished weight in every exchange that follows. The 12 seconds will be studied not as a diplomatic footnote, but as a replicable template, a framework for responding to insults from more powerful adversaries that any competent communications team can adapt and deploy in its own context. The architecture is not proprietary, it is structural, and structures can be reproduced. So this is where the record stands. The President of the United States called Canada pathetic in front of a global audience. Mark Carney replied with 12 seconds of facts arranged so precisely that every avenue of rebuttal was closed, every counterpunch was preempted, and the most relentless verbal combatant in contemporary political life stood through 11 seconds of silence that the cameras preserved in permanent, frame-by-frame detail. The White House spent 48 hours cycling through response strategies that amplified the footage rather than containing it. International allies declined to defend the insult while publicly reaffirming their regard for Canada. Energy markets and commercial partners began reassessing their exposure to the Trump brand. Licensing partners opened reviews. Booking figures declined. 3 Republican senators called for more disciplined engagement, tacitly conceding that the president's own language had created the opening that Carney stepped into and exploited with precision. Can a president whose defining public identity rests on the ability to dominate any verbal exchange sustain that reputation after the world watched 12 seconds leave him without a reply? Can any insult survive a response so precisely constructed that the word at the center of the insult migrates permanently from the target back to the speaker? And beyond this president, this confrontation, and this particular moment, if 12 seconds of calmly delivered facts can silence the most aggressive verbal presence in modern politics, what does that reveal about the actual relationship between volume and precision, between force and accuracy, and about which one prevails when they meet on a stage where the cameras never stop recording? Trump called Canada pathetic. Carney delivered 12 seconds. Trump delivered 11 seconds of silence. And the global audience, the diplomatic community, and the historical record will retain only one of those 3 things. Not the insult, not the silence, but the 12 seconds that made the silence unavoidable. 41 words, 3 sentences. One conclusion that no one inside the White House has been able to answer, that no communication strategy has managed to reframe, and that will be cited in negotiation courses, communication seminars, and case studies of what happens when precision meets aggression and the cameras are running. The word pathetic now describes the leader who insulted the ally he cannot replace. It does not describe the ally. And the silence that followed those 4 final words has not stopped speaking.